I watch seasonal anime, and as is true for any given season, you get a wide array of shows that you look forward to every week, and things where you don't look forward to hitting the play button. For the winter 2023 season, if you forced me to pick the shows that have left the sourest taste in my mouth, there were a couple of contenders. Spy Classroom is a poorly organized mess of plot and characterization, with the character designs by Kinoshita Sumie and animations at Studio Feel being one of the only redeeming features. Mononogatari has failed to leave any kind of lasting impression or memory, both in terms of its narrative and its visual style, leaving almost each episode to enter in one ear and then out the other. But I would much rather sit through both of those in their entirety than even a single episode of The Angel Next Door Spoils Me Rotten again. This show has rapidly ascended the list of my most hated anime, not only ever since I started watching seasonals regularly, but also as one of my most hated anime that I have ever seen in general. What initially started out as a show on Saturday mornings where I had a rather nonplussed reaction to it for the first couple of episodes, ultimately went off the deep end and became an experience that caused nothing but hair-pulling aggravation. For those of you who have viewed my content before, and for those of you who are new, welcome, like, comment, subscribe, notification bell, all that jazz, you know that getting angry is not a thing that I like to do here. Contrary to how some may perceive media critics or content creators, I don't go into things I watch for the purposes of knocking it down a peg or trying to stand against the popular consensus because it nets me metaphorical points with whatever intelligentsia is out there. But when the only joy that I derive out of watching something is by commenting and ranting about how bad it is or what I think is wrong with it in an angry tone, that's a problem. I don't make it a habit to be caustic or cynical on purpose, but I have no love for this series itself. I say this without irony or reservations, and I speak with utmost sincerity. I despise The Angel Next Door Spoils Me Rotten. Now, before I dive into the show proper, I need to make something very clear. If this is a show that you happen to like, that is completely fine. If the show has provided you with laughs, or sent you into an epic squeeing cycle from its romance, or you found yourself able to relate to an aspect of it, I'm happy for you, and I mean that genuinely. After all, why on earth would I ever want someone to actively dislike something that they see? It would also be a rather disingenuous thing to want that, since the sign-off for the channel is happy viewing, everyone. I am not making this video for the express purpose of changing anyone's mind, but rather to try and articulate what it is precisely that made me so upset while I was watching this series. I'm going to be getting far more pinpoint and prodding than I normally do, and though I know I'm not going to be able to get to everything that I want, I'm going to apologize in advance if anything that I say comes across as needlessly insulting. But I'm also going to do my best to present myself as unfiltered as possible, since capturing the raw emotion of what I felt is important in conveying all this information. This should also go without saying, but for the sake of full disclosure, there will be spoilers for this anime, so if you have not yet seen the series, and you want to, and you don't want to have anything ruined for you in advance, consider this your warning. So with all that preamble out of the way, let's talk about what this show is and why it made me the angry one. The Angel Next Door Spoils Me Rotten, or Otonari no Tenshi-sama ni Itsunomani ka Damme Ningen ni Sarete Taken, is a 12-episode winter 2023 anime created at Studio Project No. 9. Though given the sheer amount of outsourcing that was done on the production, to say that Project No. 9 did it comes with a bit of an asterisk. It's based on an ongoing light novel series with the original story by Saeki-san that started releasing in January 2022. The romantic comedy follows the story of a boy named Fujimiya Amane, a high school student who lives by himself in a one-bedroom apartment away from his family. While walking home from school one day in the rain, he sees his school's most popular girl, Shina Mahiru, who goes by the nickname Angel, sitting on a swing and looking sad. In a moment of kindness, he offers her his umbrella so that she doesn't get too wet or catch a cold. Amane therefore becomes the one who catches a cold the next day when he goes to school because he walked home without an umbrella. And as we all know in anime, being outside in the rain for a few minutes is all that it takes to become horribly ill. As luck would have it, though, it turns out that Mahiru lives in the apartment right next door to him, and, as a way to thank him for lending her the umbrella, offers to take care of him by nursing him back to health by cooking porridge, as well as helping to tidy up his space. This sets off a dynamic between the two of them that involves Mahiru constantly coming over to Amane's apartment to help cook for him and turn his outlook on life, both in terms of his health and his self-confidence, around, while Amane gradually gets to see the way that Mahiru behaves when she's not under the eyeing student body. Right off the bat, this story completely failed to grab my attention at all. Even before any semblance of romantic inclinations are given in the narrative, the presupposition that this entire relationship kicks off because of lending someone your umbrella is the kind of thing that seems unusually weak, even for supposed turn-your-brain-off teen romances. It is ultimately a trope in fiction that has become one of my least favorite, which is the idea that doing this one singular nice thing causes someone to take this personal 180-degree turn, ushering in a grand transformation into who they are. Now, it's important to stress that moments like these can, most certainly, leave an impact on someone's outlook. If you're having a terrible day, but someone does something that is unusually kind or complimentary, it can no doubt have a great impact on your mood. The difference here, however, is that it's not like a character was introduced to a new hobby or had a life event so extreme that it has more or less turned their entire world upside down. This was someone lending someone else an umbrella. That's it. There was no implication of friendship involved. The problem is not in the deed itself, because doing a nice thing is, well, nice to see, but rather in the overinflated sense of just how important the deed was. Mahiru deciding to do something nice in exchange for the umbrella lending is, itself, not a bad or poor setup for getting the two characters to do more interacting, but rather is poor in what it leads to. Since both Mahiru and Amane go to the same school, it would have perhaps been most sensible for Mahiru to simply give it back to Amane in class the next day, along with telling him that she will still owe him a small favor in exchange for that. The angel next door spoils me rotten, however, does not go that route. As for why, we'll get to that. So the series has to cook up a new way to get the two to interact and set up Mahiru paying back Amane. After the absurd coincidence that these two high school students that live by themselves are next-door neighbors, Mahiru's gestures of wanting to return the favor to Amane are cosmically blown out of proportion. Amane lent her his umbrella, but how is that supposed to somehow trigger in Mahiru the idea, or the desire, to basically come into Amane's life and start spoiling him by cooking all his meals and cleaning his apartment, among other things? The gesture that kickstarted this entire relationship has a ridiculous disparity between the good deed and the repayment, a sentiment which subsequently tinges all of Amane and Mahiru's conversations and moments moving forward. There's also the overarching idea that Amane was a slouch who did nothing more than the bare minimum to take care of himself, which more or less completely changes not because of his own desire to better himself, but because Mahiru has been doing so much of the work to improve his life. And this begs a rather interesting question. Why on earth would anyone want to take care of Amane anyway? Amane is the first primary way in which this series completely fails in regards to its characters, and part of the reason for that failure lies in the reality that he has, more or less, no real personality to call his own. Our first introduction to him in episode 1 is laced with the visual image that he almost never smiles, opting to be caustic, stoic, or impersonable in most of his interactions at school, such as with his friend Itsuki, and even with Mahiru at times. The entire persona he gives off is brusque, blank, and unwelcoming, such to the point where it feels less like a character quirk and more an aspect of his actual personality. And here's the thing. How many stories have you read where the main character is, in some way, brusque, blank, exudes a rather unwelcoming presence, or embodies being in some way closed off until someone else manages to force the door to their heart open? Amane is, in this respect, the archetypical teenager of bad young adult fiction characterization. A character who on some level is so fundamentally not trying in terms of interacting with others, we'll get to that later, which in turn makes it difficult to make me identify with him as an audience member who's supposed to be watching this journey of self-actualization and getting closer to Amane. The material, however, tries to show that underneath the colder exterior lies someone who is actually nice at heart, and that all he needed was the right combination and circumstances in order to let his true colors show. During his sleepover with Itsuki in episode 7, he comments that he's aware everyone in class considers him a gloomy person, a persona that he seemingly perpetuates of his own volition. Even if innate niceness of his personality was something that was always there, it certainly does his sense of interior motivation and drive no favors. The fact that his apartment is such a messy, unkempt place reflects that he would never actually do any of the cleaning under his own willpower. Mahiru more or less has to press and prod him into doing it. With Amane's personality and desire to improve himself being this bland and uninteresting, and not even allowing us to glimpse some more aspects of his personality, such as talking about his interests or hobbies even beyond episode 1, there is no coherent map to latch onto with him. Why would I want to spend time watching a character who seems to encapsulate the notion of the lazy teenager, but this particular lazy teenager somehow manages to get a girl to basically take care of himself day in and day out, seemingly by accident? Amane himself in episode 1 rhetorically asks the question, what is she, my mom? But he nevertheless apparently sees no need to put a damper on these status quo circumstances. At no point does he overtly tell Mahiru to stop coming to his apartment, and why should he? Why put in the effort for self-sufficiency when it is a lot safer to indulge in the fantasy that someone else can come into your life and magically do everything for you? Amane's development is aggravatingly bolstered by Mahiru's active involvement in his day-to-day functioning, rather than of anything inherent to who he is as a character. And even in the later episodes, after months have passed, and you would assume that Mahiru wouldn't be needed so much around the apartment, she is still there every day cooking for him. While he does try to make strides to better himself by deciding to exercise and study more proactively, even though he's consistently in the top 30, and perhaps does tidy up his place every once in a while, and do some more care for his personal grooming, he never stops giving off the air that he is woefully dependent on Mahiru to contribute to his growth, because he never would have done so of his own volition. He therefore becomes the subject of an I can fix them narrative, rather than a sincere romantic lead character. And one of the ways in which Mahiru tries to fix Amane is to get him to open up about why exactly he decided to move out on his own and away from his family, in episode 10 of 12. For all the time that they spent together, it took all the way until episode 10 for the two of them to have a conversation that, if they really were as close as the narrative insisted that they are, should have had a long time ago. Amane and Mahiru have spent the better part of the past 6 to 7 months together if the timeline of the anime is to be believed. But it's only here at this point that Amane apparently feels comfortable enough to have this conversation with Mahiru, despite apparently having no problem petting her head or holding her hand out in public, we'll get to that later, or allowing her to dump her own life story. So, the reason why Amane decided to move out on his own was because back when he was in junior high school, 3 people that he used to call his friends were apparently just using him for their own ends, including saying the immortal line, "For someone like you, your only worth is to be used by me." I'm sorry, can I just pause for a minute and say how laughably bad this bit of dialogue is? I love it when people try and write how they think edgy teenagers talk. Let me ask something. Does anyone you know actually talk like this? Does anyone actually think in terms of this and simultaneously broadcast it by speaking it aloud? Well, anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. This experience was apparently so traumatizing for Amane that he ultimately lost the ability to trust his other friends or the schoolmates around him, so he decided to switch schools and live on his own. All of this, by the way, is framed with absolutely zero input or interaction in flashback with his parents, who I imagine might have probably tried to talk him out of it, or wanted to say a few things on the matter themselves. This entire backstory is also why, when Kadawaki tries befriending Amane in episode 8, Amane is tensed by the offer and immediately suspects that something is up, when, in reality, the hand of friendship does seem genuine. I'm going to call this what it is. Fucking stupid. You mean to make me believe that Amane was apparently so upset that some people he thought he was close to weren't actually close to him, that he decided to stop trusting everyone and move out on his own, and that he did this with virtually no self-sustenance skills, and that his parents were apparently okay with this? This is such an extreme reaction that I'd be half tempted to think that it was trying to be funny if it wasn't played off as purely serious. Amane just tried to Alt F4 his life by moving somewhere else because of some guys he could have just stopped talking to and formed other friendships. But he didn't really try fostering genuine friendships after that, so he just became some brusque and interior guy through his fear of commitment instead? Amane's reaction is so out of proportion for something that is, in the grand scheme of things, trivial. Friends come and go, and sometimes that means that the people you thought you knew perhaps had some kind of ulterior motive. Sometimes that means that other people let you down. There's a word for that. It's called life. Move the fuck on. Amane's response is the kind of action that only makes sense in a reality where your understanding of people is horribly black and white, completely divorced from any sense of realism or dramatically plausible deniability. Amane himself even says that he knows not everyone is like that, but he became paralyzed by fear when he started to suspect everyone and couldn't trust them. Even if we were to operate under the assumption that these people who hurt Amane were the only friends that he had, or hell, even that they were the very first friends he had, which is in and of itself an extremely sad prospect to think about, it still makes for an astoundingly flimsy justification for why he moved out to another school away from home, apparently with his parents' blessing. There isn't even a real implication that it could be because of an underlying, undiagnosed anxiety problem. It's just presented completely as is. Amane's mental landscape is so immature and broken, and given how his personability barely improves as the show continues, it's all the more hysterical that the show thinks that he can be an eventual emotional outlet for Mahiru, much less a love interest. And speaking of which, Mahiru's manner of being, as understood by the others around her, is as an angelic person with enviable looks, athleticism, and intellect. Along with her penchant for tidiness and cooking delicious meals, she is, by every conceivable definition to a young heterosexual male, the perfect woman. She also comes complete with a lot of the stereotypical things that are associated with being a person with a high-class upbringing, such as not having experienced completely mundane, everyday things that most people have experienced. At the end of episode 1, Amane treats Mahiru to a takeout pizza, which is apparently such a new concept since she has never had this before. I'm not saying that it is completely outside the realm of possibility, but I find it preposterous that this is the case. Pizza is not only a dime a dozen kind of establishment that seems to multiply in shopping center lots every year, but am I supposed to buy the idea that in all that time Mahiru went to school, her movements were monitored so closely that she has never had a takeout pizza? Even before she may have fully crystallized her angel persona, none of the other people in her class thought that they would want to take her out to get some? Needless to say, I raise my eyebrow at this. But Mahiru not having had pizza is ultimately not the point. What is the point is that throughout the course of the story, it plays upon the notion of taking the projected image of the most popular girl in school and tearing away at the cracks in the facade to see what lies underneath. The conceit, therefore, is to allow Mahiru to open herself up to someone that will be willing to take her seriously, and not be devastated when the angelic portrayal that she carries around with her is allowed to soften. While I've already explained that Amane is by far not in any way someone who should be mentally mature enough to handle the problems of another person since he can barely take care of himself, let's actually explore for a bit what makes Mahiru tick. Mahiru, much like Amane, lives by herself in the apartment, separated from her parents by distance both literal and metaphorical. The idea that Mahiru's parents are not a loving presence in her life is, frankly, not in any way a revelation or a surprise. Most of the time in anime, when a character lives by themselves, it's usually because their parents are constantly away on business, they're both dead, or that the relationship between parents and children is frosty, to say the least. There's also, of course, the narrative convenience in not needing to worry about having two more characters to write as mainstay presences in the story. Mahiru living by herself is, in essence, a supplement to the idea that she is mostly an island unto herself. She has few connections, if any, that she can call earnest and sincere, and the few relationships that she does have are horribly strained. As she eventually reveals in episode 7, the relationship she has with her parents is so bad that not only is she not on loving terms with either of them, but that they both absolutely want nothing to do with her, and that they're pretty much waiting until she graduates from university to be free of her being her guardians. This is part of the reason why her mother was grumbling about paperwork when she visited. They're more or less just giving her money so that she's out of their hair. Her entire life was filled with such an onslaught of parental neglect, being raised by housekeepers, and apparently being told point blank that she's not wanted, that ultimately led to her sitting on the swing in the rain when Amane came over with the umbrella. It's structured as the one straw that broke the camel's back, the idea that she could operate under the illusion that her parents did actually care about her somehow, only to have that illusion torn away. Now, look, I don't want to come across as completely heartless here. Any circumstance in which a child is raised in an environment with uncaring parents or is unable to receive emotional validation for their successes or support in their failures is nothing short of absolutely horrible. It doesn't matter how old the child is or how economically well off the parents are. It can have long-lasting implications that reverberate into the child's later adolescence and even into their adulthood. Having said that, the sheer amount of kick the puppy that the show engages in to try and make Mahiru's backstory sympathetic and someone that the viewer would likewise want to protect goes so far off the cliff that it feels just as contrived as the entire situation that kickstarted Amane and Mahiru's relationship in the first place. I do not doubt in any way that there are some children who exist that have gone horribly unloved by their parents or guardians, or had parents or guardians that did indeed love them, but could not provide healthily for them because of circumstances beyond their control, be they economic or emotional reasons. But to say that I buy this as a dramatic device employed in The Angel Next Door Spoils Me Rotten is not true at all. The show relied on Mahiru's misery to get started and relies on Mahiru's misery for development that crosses the boundary into excessive. It's as though Saeki-san said while writing this, I could give her a bad relationship with her parents, but how do I make it even worse by having them be overtly neglectful both in action and dialogue? This is why, in the brief moment that we see Mahiru's mother when she goes to visit, her entire dialogue is just laced with pure venom and contempt. The narrative seems artificially built to dump on Mahiru, which is why Mahiru's lack of making connections likewise feels forced. The narrative does not address Mahiru's elementary or middle school life because it would introduce too many opportunities to poke a hole in her iron wall of loneliness backstory, so we have to operate under the assumption that she had no friends in that period of her life, and not to question it. At least Amane's backstory happened in junior high. And just as contrived as that is the obsession with her popularity in the here and now. Mahiru's main concern at the beginning of the story is that she doesn't want to be seen with Amane because it would result in a lot of nosy butting in from other members of her class, and that rumors would spread that would be detrimental to her angelic image. This explains why simply returning the umbrella at the school was apparently not an option. The two characters thus swear their constant spending time together, we'll get to that later, is to remain a secret. The problem is that Mahiru's worry about her popularity image and wanting to uphold it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. If the main concern is that people will not want to spend time with her once they see that the image of her popularity is just a facade, then allow me to ask a very basic question. As the story proceeds onward, why then do Amane, Chitose, Itsuki, and eventually Kadawaki continue to spend time with her? If Mahiru's real personality was indeed as unneeded as she claims that to be, then she never would have felt the compulsion to lower her guard around them at all. Even if you want to say that Amane seeing her in a moment of weakness out in the rain was an unintended coincidence, and calling it a coincidence is giving it more credit than it deserves, then she should have kept all future interactions with Amane as brief as possible and never bothered taking care of him in a substantial fashion. There is, however, an argument to be made here that Mahiru taking care of Amane is an extension of her angel persona, that she was willing to care for someone else for the purposes of enhancing the air of mystique surrounding her. The problem with this argument, though, is that Mahiru herself reveals to Amane within the first episode that she does not like being referred to as Angel, despite doing everything in her power to be perfect or validate her own existence. So it's a rather paradoxical situation that she would spend so much time caring for Amane and behaving in a way that one would expect an angel to behave, while also not liking the nickname that behaving in such a way would cause other people to see her. But as stated before, Mahiru's real underlying issue is her self-loathing, and she even acknowledges that she's feeling self-loathing for the consequences of her own doing. So she apparently has the self-awareness to recognize a completely informed character flaw in the very persona that she is portraying and how it affects her view of herself, but cannot take 10 minutes in the many months that she and Amane have spent together and ask herself why he or his friends still like having her around? They've seen more of her real personality than anyone that she knows, so don't you think that they would have dumped her by now if they thought she was not worth their time or attention? If they decided to stick around because it would be the nice thing to do rather than for the purposes of actually being friends, it would be the kind of false relationship that Amane was so wary of before. The angel next door spoils me rotten, however, gives no cause to suspect that this is the case. So then this begs another pair of questions, the first of which being, if Amane, Chitose, Itsuki, and Kadawaki are all aware of Mahiru outside of school and are more privy to seeing her when she's not really in her angel mode, why does she still insist on keeping up the facade for as long as she does? Let's assume the absolute worst for a minute, and say that if she were to start acting unangelically and all the attention that she has evaporates, that doesn't mean that the other 4 friends that she has are going to all of a sudden go away, or is she going to make like Amane and move somewhere else and start all over again? I know that high school is not necessarily the friendliest place in the world, as my own experiences would surely attest, but Mahiru clearly has a support network of people who care about the real her, or at least the realist version of her that we've seen, and want to spend time with her, popularity be damned. Mahiru keeps deciding to obfuscate the truth about her supposed not relationship with Amane, despite the fact that she has no solid rationale to do so, because it's unlikely that she'll ever win over her parents, and because it causes her so much annoyance and being perturbed. The second question it therefore asks is, did Mahiru never, at any point, consider that perhaps allowing aspects of her real personality to shine through would have been a good way to gradually ease away the popular image of herself that she hates so much? In allowing herself to express interest or curiosity in some more down-to-earth or perhaps even stereotypically girly things, or hell, perhaps even some things that aren't considered stereotypically girly, it could have gone a good way in giving her a more fleshed-out characterization. Because so much of her past is skipped over to emphasize just how much her parents don't love her, it means to imply that she never thought to do this at any point prior to the start of the series. The tragedy of her lack of parental love operates under the hope that you don't take a few seconds to stop and think just how much personal information we've not been given. Even if you want to say that she doesn't have to divulge it or that it's private, I find that an unusual remark to make, considering that she just literally dumped her entire emotional baggage with her backstory. So the sheer breadth and depth of her emotional trauma is okay to talk about, but not this? It's amazing that, for as fantastically affluent as she is, the show at no point uses the excuse that other people were using friendship with her for monetary gain as a potential reason for her closed-off attitude. The show actually passes up a genuinely interesting connection thread between the two characters about how money as a dominating force in relationships of any sort can come fraught with potential problems. The funny thing is that the show actually insinuates that this is the case because Mahiru frames her parents' relationship as being forged more from mutual financial interests rather than anything resembling affective love. The angel next door spoils me rotten decides not to draw this connection between Amane and Mahiru, which is made funnier considering that Amane's fake friends used him for money and he's nowhere close to being as wealthy as Mahiru. With all this being said, we have an entire dimension of Mahiru's personal history that is just unexplored. As a result of not investigating this, Mahiru grew up developing a completely lonely personality that shirks away any sense of connection to other people if she can help it. Hence why she always keeps classmates at a distance and uses the aura of popularity and mystique to have attention drawn to her. But that's all broken by this one random guy in her class doing this one random act of kindness. Mahiru is, much like Amane, emotionally immature despite her supposedly admirable qualities, which also makes her under-equipped to be a love interest herself. You can use the idea of no parental love as an excuse only up to a certain point. The end product is that Mahiru herself becomes a subject of an I can fix them narrative, which makes that the case for both Mahiru and Amane. And I really don't think I need to explain why the idea of falling into a relationship with someone when the initial modus operandi is I can fix them is a bad idea. There's a distinct difference between providing emotional support for a partner, which is something that really should go without saying, versus essentially being someone's therapist, which is how they both function. They've become so unhealthily codependent on one another that it fails to be romantic and comes across as just so fucking sad that it's gotten to this point. And speaking of romance, that is, far and away, the thing that kills this anime for me. The Angel Next Door Spoils Me Rotten's main goal as a narrative is to convince its audience that the main couple, Amane and Mahiru, are a couple that is worth watching falling in love gradually week to week. The true frustration of the story for me is that I cannot buy this as a romance at all, whether at both the actual romantic level or the comedic level. But before I expand on this, we need to explain something clearly from the beginning. Any romance story, whether comedic in nature or serious in nature, requires in some form or another a delay of the eventual confession. The characters, understandably, need to take some time to understand their own feelings about the other and evaluate themselves whether it's worth it to ask the all-important question, will you be my significant other? As Itsuki points out in episode 6, the fear of rejection is one of the primary things that can hold back asking that very thing. I'm saying this now because I don't want to make it seem like my problem with this story is that they didn't get together at an early stage of the story like, episode 3. For the sake of argument, let's put aside my grievances with finding the entire manner of how they got together contrived, along with the idea that I think that both of these characters, personality or maturity-wise, are really not in any way interesting or endearing as romantic partners. In the original source material, there is no confession scene until the end of Volume 4, which, at the rate that the anime is adapting the material, will certainly be the last episode of its run. I don't have an inherent problem with this. The big confession is the most sensible stopping point for the end of a season, assuming that it gets more, and if it doesn't get any more seasons adapted, then it gives the viewer an incentive to read the original source material beyond what the anime covered to see the aftermath of what happens. The problem, however, is that two characters constantly cohabitating, yet not becoming an actual official couple until the very end, is not that interesting of a story. But it seems as though the material knows that this is the case, and so, in order to try to get around this, The Angel Next Door Spoils Me Rotten decides that it's going to dump a whole slew of romantic moments and images into the course of the story for the sake of providing something to cling to as the fated hour arrives. But all of these moments reek of artificiality for two reasons. The first reason is that the show leans so heavily into its physical and linguistic innuendo that it makes it so perplexing that they aren't a sincere, committed couple yet. Whether it be apparently allowing Amane to rest his head on her lap in episode 8, bridal carrying her to his bed when she gets a fever, which, much like getting a cold from being out in the rain for a few minutes, is such an over-the-top reaction, and holding her hand while she sleeps in episode 4, addressing each other by first name in private company starting in episode 3, holding hands at the mall on your day out in episode 9, Mahiru insinuating that they do something for Amane's birthday next year and greeting him at the door like a newlywed wife and openly remarking that she doesn't like it when boys touch her, but she doesn't mind when Amane does it in episode 6, Amane confessing that he had a sexual dream about Mahiru and her wanting to use what he did in it as reference to make his heart race in episode 10. Write that down, write that down! The list just goes on. The writing on the wall is so brazen that the paint ink smell is still palpable. The narrative and plot drop so many hints at the budding feelings between the two of them that it makes it completely bewildering that even at so late a stage, they cannot bridge this last emotional gap. You've already done all of the other things that other high school anime couples sometimes agonize over, so why on earth should the fear of rejection therefore be something that still looms over your head? The material wants the characters to go through the physical motions of being a couple without making the emotional commitment, because each one somehow thinks that they're not good enough, I guess. It indulges in a fantasy that is past the point of saccharine and into exaggeratedly cloying. The question that I am constantly asking myself is, if they're apparently comfortable doing all of this hinting and physical action, then how the hell is it that they both can't be bothered to actually address their feelings, which would make all of the physical actions and physical proximity more meaningful? All of the things that the anime community jokes about being lewd, like hand-holding, head-patting, or characters asking questions like, what would you do if I did this lewd thing, are constantly being done in-universe here. But it's all under the thin veneer of, we're not actually in a relationship, or we don't have that kind of relationship. The second reason is precisely because they are not a couple yet after all these months. The idea that two characters sharing a genuine moment of physical intimacy with the entire air cleared cannot somehow be acceptable after they've been spending this much time together for this long. The fact that Amane and Mahiru have, more or less, been playing married house for the past several months, but have not gotten together yet and declared themselves a couple. Yeah, I know I messed up that take. I don't care. I'm rolling with it anyway. Nor kissed, nor had sex, goes far beyond any sense of dramatically plausible deniability. And before anyone interjects and says, but you don't need to have sex to feel connected to someone, to that I say, this is true. But what is supposed to be so compelling about the connection between these two as it stands now? Why should I give one iota about the life of their dynamic when the primary exercise they are both engaging in is active, personal, emotional suppression? There's denying one's feelings despite the writing on the wall, and then there's denying them to the point where you decide to just knock the wall down altogether. The anime flat out refuses to let its characters acknowledge what is hanging over their heads, or if any acknowledgement of it does happen, it still involves perpetually dancing around the issue rather than simply saying point blank, we need to talk about this. And for two people who are so close, it is laughable that this has gone on for as long as it has. They've been honest about so many other things. What's stopping this? As I have stated more than once, Mahiru and Amane's hang-up about other people learning about their relationship is a load of crock because of Itsuki, Chitose, and Kadawaki being their friends now. But they cling to it because that's the only way that this show can perpetuate its playing house fantasy. And no, I thoroughly reject the notion that there is a genuine semblance of realism here, apart from what I mentioned earlier about fear of rejection and romantic storytelling formats. There is no realism in a girl deciding out of the goodness of her heart to come and cook for you every day, take care of your house, etc. Correction, there is a realism to it. It's called being a wife or a girlfriend in the most stereotypical, patriarchal interpretation of the word. And I don't buy the rationale that what they really feel is a we don't like labels stance. This entire status quo is crafted on the basis that they want to avoid being labeled as a couple, for fear of what it would do to Mahiru's personality label, popularity label. I know I screwed up that take too. I don't care. I'm still going. If they really didn't care, then Mahiru of all people probably would have said something by now. Okay, maybe you can argue she does that in episode 10 when she says that she was at the mall with the most important person to her after getting questioned about the rumor by her classmates approaching her, but of course, she doesn't say that it was Amane. And why? Because being vague and elusive to everyone is, of course, a surefire sign that you like someone. It's for all of these reasons that I likewise don't find any of Mahiru and Amane's interactions funny, either in regards to their feelings towards one another or about anything else that manages to come along. Let's take, for instance, one single sequence just to illustrate what I mean, such as the whole wet dream sequence and confession in episode 10. Amane has just admitted to Mahiru something that is, to put it mildly, profoundly embarrassing. Now, it would be one thing if this was with two characters who actually were sexually active, which would mean that the other partner would have a more keen interest in what actually happened. I'm not saying it would have to happen in precisely this manner, but it may probably lead to both poking fun at the dream and also expressing curiosity as to its contents to see if it's something that they should try. That, in and of itself, opens up the idea of being more specific about what actually happened, which could lead to a punchline of, yeah, maybe we shouldn't do that, or that sounds kinda hot, actually. But the thing is, Amane really doesn't have any business confessing this to Mahiru. When he gets confronted about his exhaustion by Chitose and Mahiru at school, he uses the excuse that he's been working out in the morning. But lo and behold, when he gets home, apparently Mahiru gets him to say that he's been fantasizing about her. Allow me to ask a perfectly reasonable question. Have you ever confessed to someone you were sexually attracted to, but not actually in a relationship with, that you had a sexual dream about them? And what's more, that the other person decided to inquire about it further for the purposes of possibly referencing it later? When this moment happened in the episode, I had to pause and let out a groan so loudly that the person in the apartment hallway actually asked, "The fuck was that?" This entire situation between Amane and Mahiru, complete with a first-time joke, refers back to what I have insinuated before about all this innuendo, untied to any actual requiting of feelings that comes across as sincere. The lifelessness I feel in their romantic connection means that the comedic moments that are likewise supposed to bring them together ring as unfunny. They're flaccid jokes stroked by a story that constantly mistakes its moments between the two characters as building to a justifiable climax, when all it's doing is calling attention to the sheer improbability of the state of things as they are. I'll put it succinctly. The romance in The Angel Next Door Spoils Me Rotten is not very good. It projects an image of romance that is a complete fabrication, so saccharine in its physical, emotional, and emotional maturity element. It argues that you don't need to bridge that final gap in connection to indulge in having someone take care of you in the way that only the closest people do. I can understand a friend wanting to bring you soup because you don't feel well. Hell, my own friends did that once in college when I missed 2 days worth of classes. But to extend that far beyond and into months at a time is laughable. It extols sexlessness as a virtue and emotional suppression as wholesome. And the truly hysterical thing about all of this is that there actually are two groups of characters within the show that provide far more intrigue than Mahiru and Amane do. The first of the two is Chitose and Itsuki, who, barring the fact that they themselves are already a couple, are each far more expressive and personable than either Mahiru or Amane, either together or separately. Consider for a minute that our first introduction to Itsuki is him poking fun at Amane for getting a cold in episode 1. Is it a rather rude thing to do? Well, yeah, but to say that he has spunk and a bluntness that doesn't futz around would be an understatement. And Chitose being a metaphorical ball of energy is itself a strong counterbalance to the cold wall that is Amane and Mahiru's dialogue. Though I do have to say, I really could have done without Chitose commenting on the perfection that is Mahiru's body with the tracking shot in episode 4. If Chitose and Itsuki have any real problem in the story, it's not necessarily that their personalities are comparatively over the top, because the show needs to provide some kind of contrast between Amane and Mahiru and them, but rather that the entire understanding of their relationship is predicated on spending all of their time with Mahiru and Amane, which means that there's an entire dimension of them that we never see. This unfortunately relegates them rather often to acting like Hollywood gossip columnists who are making overt comments or asides about the situation. It makes me wonder just what on earth an official couple in this universe would do. Does Itsuki tell Chitose about the sexual dreams that he has about her as well? Since Chitose comes over to Amane's apartment for cooking lessons with Mahiru in episode 9, does that mean that Chitose's cooking was so bad that she gave Itsuki food poisoning by accident one time? What kinds of things do they do or places do they go when they aren't in Amane's beige-as-hell apartment? What was the argument that Itsuki implied he had with his father concerning Chitose in episode 7? Do his parents not approve of his relationship with her for one reason or another, such as the fact that Amane says the reason Itsuki's grades are so poor is because of Chitose always being on his mind? Unironically, I want to see an OVA series of just the two of them doing cute stuff together and away from the main couple. There's no guarantee that it will be good, but if this series has been any indication, it would likely be far better than this. They may not necessarily be the sharpest tools in the shed, but they do very clearly care about each other and enjoy one another's company in a manner that is far more convincing and sincere than what Amane and Mahiru do. The other noteworthy couple is Amane's parents. His mother drops in for an unannounced visit in episode 3, which, to be fair, is a pretty impolite thing to do. I know that if I received a random visitor when I wasn't expecting one, my first reaction would be to act rather impatient or short with them. However, it is worth noting that apparently she and her husband are paying the rent for Amane's place, which, Jesus Christ, I wish paying rent was a thing I didn't need to worry about. So she essentially sent her own son off to live by himself with few life sustenance skills, and is willing to foot the bill for all of it, along with an allowance so that he can eat. She also manages to read the absurdly blatant writing on the wall and assumes that Amane and Mahiru are a couple, and she's evidently totally cool with the fact that a beautiful girl is in his apartment seemingly at all hours, and that they're both unsupervised. I know that some may find her inquisitiveness, teasing, and prying into Amane's personal life, both here and when she returns with her husband for the shrine visit in episode 5, to be incredibly off-putting. And for good reason, too. Nobody likes having their mother and father pry too deeply into their personal lives. But it should be remarked that they're letting Amane live by himself for months at a time, and we don't see him at any point check in with either of his parents. The sheer amount of latitude that they give him is so comedically vast that I can honestly look past the unannounced visit. With the way that the parents talk in his apartment after Mahiru prepares them some tea, and how they interact with Amane and Mahiru together and separately, I find myself gravitating towards wanting to, much like with Itsuki and Chitose, know more about them and how they interact. When the bright points about the series are the characters who are, in most respects, pretty antithetical to the main romantic duo in terms of personality, it might not be an exaggeration to say that I fucking hate this show. Plus, the energy that the characters bring to the story is most welcome, especially since the show in general is just so dull to look at. I haven't really spent any time talking about the overall aesthetic presentation of the show, since I'm far more concerned with the characterization and how it tries to strike its emotional chords, but I don't have anything complimentary to say either about the visual aspect. I'm going to keep this section short, and I'm deliberately not going to talk about the OP or the PowerPoint presentation of an ED, because that's small potatoes. For starters, it's worth commenting that about 85% of the show's scenes take place in Amane's apartment, and to call it bland is rather charitable. Beige, brown, and off-white seem to be such predominant colors employed throughout, and there is no character or even modest tokens of pizzazz or life within it. I'm not saying that I need the place to look as wild or bursting with color and life as, say, the Takakura house in Mawaru Penguin Drum, but is it really too much of an ask to have a poster or two set up somewhere? Especially with the sheer number of times Mahiru and Amane are sitting at the table eating food or talking on the couch, the camera itself seems to be using the same types of angles and shots over and over again. While the actual day-to-day events of The Angel Next Door Spoils Me Rotten are relatively mundane and aren't the kinds of things that require intensity in the shot composition, that's really not an excuse for the shots themselves to be inane or uncreative. Even in the few times that the show manages to break away from the apartment and show us other places, like the school or the shopping mall date or a couple of scenes outside, it doesn't come anywhere close to being able to make up for the fact that so much of what I saw felt so visually deadening. Oh, and sakura blossoms often signify the birth of new beginnings and optimism, like love and stuff. So I guess the series gets a point for using one of the most common anime-manga imagery tropes. I just used the word deadening to describe this series, and honestly, that's what it felt like for so much of it. Between The Angel Next Door Spoils Me Rotten's aesthetic choices and the manner by which it sets up everything in its story and characters and narrative, watching this series from week to week moved from being a nuisance to a thing that I no longer found salvageable. You may justifiably ask yourself, well, ZNote, if you didn't enjoy watching it, then why did you finish it? Or aren't you overthinking it? As for that first question, my answer is that I do earnestly subscribe to the idea that to truly understand why something does or does not work, that involves seeing it through to the finish. Or if it's an adaptation, seeing how far it goes before the original material continues onward. I'm not satisfied with watching 2 or 3 episodes of something and calling it a night. I feel the innate need to understand why something does or does not resonate with me. Dropping something means missing out on opportunities to explore my own aesthetic sensibilities, and yes, that sometimes includes having intensely negative reactions. As for that second question, well, it's still a piece of entertainment that demands your time and investment compared to the millions of others that exist. The emotional quality of the series was so unengaging from the onset that I had to figure out why, and see if it changed my mind later. It's not that I'm heartless, it's just that my heart wasn't in this. As I said, I got far more upset and far more cynical than I normally do throughout the course of this video, and if you somehow managed to make it to the very end, I don't know what to say aside from a sincere thank you, and to express the hope that anything I said made some semblance of sense. Though I mentioned at the start that I did not create this video for the purposes of changing anyone's mind, I do hope that I could at least express why I not only thoroughly hate this anime, but also why I cannot recommend it, and why I also have no compulsion to read the original light novels, regardless of what was cut in the adaptation transition. We should remember that anime adaptations are meant to, from the capitalist business perspective, boost the interest in the original work to increase sales. In the case of The Angel Next Door Spoils Me Rotten, it spectacularly failed to stimulate any interest I might have had in it. Once the series airs its final episode this coming Saturday, I will not miss it. There may have supposedly been an angel in the course of this story, but perhaps I was more of an atheist than I realized. Thank you for watching. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, join Discord, follow my other social media, or donate to my Patreon. In the meantime, this has been ZNote of ZNoteTaku. Happy viewing, everyone!